Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. You know, knowing my roots has always been intriguing to me. I used to sit with my grandpa Hicks and hear all the great stories he had to tell. He talked of his youth and all of his exploits of wisdom and strength. There was always big talk of the fighting and things that defined men and women during those early days. And of course, my dad carried on that great tradition of storytelling that I suppose began clear back in the early annals of Hicks lore. So I grew up knowing who my ancestors were and a bit about them. This episode isn't an expose into the history of the Hicks family by any means. But some of these stories do tell of how folks lived and thought during a different time in history in Idaho. So where did these people come from, and when did they arrive? Grandpa talked a lot about the Passamaquoddy Valley where he grew up, and the fact it was known as the Little Missouri because of all the Missourians who had migrated there. In fact, my own people came from that general region. My Hicks people were some of the first on the scene when settlers started claiming property in Idaho in the early 1800s. I don't know what prompted them to leave their farms in eastern Kansas and head west, but that's what they did. And that family migration happened not long after the Civil War ended. My guess is they got sick of the carpetbaggers and political turmoil so prevalent during those times. Let's check in on my great-great-grandpa Robert Hicks, who was responsible for bringing the Hickses to Idaho in about 1881. First of all, just know that Robert's father-in-law, a man named William Henry Lyle, had died as a result of the terrible conditions in a Union prison. His story has merit and kind of sets the stage for what happened in those days. Grandpa Lyle fought on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. He was an honorable farmer and landowner from Missouri and did what he felt was right. He was captured in battle and sent to the Alton military prison. That was a Union prison in Alton, Illinois. We can all stipulate that war is hell, and especially the Civil War. Hatred and anger defined men who fought and died on both sides of that war. To give you a glimpse of what it was like for my grandpa Lyle, living in that prison, that military prison, I'll read from a journal written by a Captain J.F. Melton, who was imprisoned around the same time as Grandpa. He said, "I was captured on the 13th of July, heavily ironed with log chain and ball, transported to this prison, thrown into a cell 6 by 3 feet with my iron fetters on, kicked, cuffed, taunted, jeered, and maltreated in every conceivable form. I remained the inmate of this living tomb until my life was despaired of. I was then removed to the hospital, where I have remained ever since, denied the privilege of a common culprit, denied a parole, denied exchange. I have had to run the gauntlet of every disease which human flesh is heir to. Smallpox, measles, mumps, pneumonia. In a word, all the ills of Pandora. Oh, the horrors of this place, the cruelty of my prosecutors. Tongue cannot tell, neither hath it entered into the hearts of man to conceive. I have seen hundreds of my companions in arms consigned to a premature and untimely grave, here by the cruelty and injustice of my enemies, murdered in cold blood in this terrible house of disease and death. In time, and to save his own life, Grandpa Lyle took an oath of loyalty to the United States federal government and was subsequently set free. He made his way back to his farm and family in Missouri, and a few weeks later he died. His daughter Annie became my great-great-grandmother when she married Robert Hicks in 1878. The two lived on the Hicks family farm in eastern Kansas until they decided to head west in 1881, like I mentioned. They and their small kids joined a wagon train and ended up in Cokeville, Wyoming, 8 months after leaving Kansas. Robert worked as a logger in Cokeville for a few months, getting out timber for the Union Pacific Railroad, and Annie cooked for the laborers. During this time, Robert got into a gunfight with a guy in town who supposedly had disrespected some of the women in the party. In the battle, Robert was shot, but he didn't die. His wife Annie nursed him back to health, and the two then set out again, bound for the famed wheat fields folks were talking about in what is now Washington State. Their journey took them into Idaho, past Eagle Rock, what is now Idaho Falls, near Arco, and down into the Camas Prairie. When the family saw that beautiful area, they knew their journey was over. Robert and Annie and their kids lived their first year in caves, along with Andrew Fletcher, M.L. Davis, and Jonas and Wilson Carter. Supplies were bought from Kelton, Utah. The family later set up homes on Coral Creek, which was at that time owned by a guy named Joe Jones, one of two settlers that the families found living on that part of the prairie when they arrived. The home on Coral Creek was later sold to a guy named Frank McCarter, and then the family moved on and later settled in Salmon. Robert Hicks made his living in Salmon as a prospector and miner. His claims were located up Stormy Peak, for those of you who know where that's at. It's a mountainous area just above Salmon. His cabins, in fact, can still be found up there. He developed a high-powered spray system to move all the soil down into a sluice box, and that's where he separated the gold from the soil. His business was profitable, and he easily supported his family with the ore he mined. Incidentally, he had a mining partner that worked side by side with him. One morning, Robert found his partner dipping into the gold stores. After a heated argument, a gun battle ensued, and Robert ended his partner's thievery with a bullet. Times were tough in those days, the good old days, and stealing a man's livelihood by taking his gold could result in dire consequences. So here's another story to ponder on. I mentioned some of the Hicks family lore I heard as a kid in the area of Passamaroy known as Little Missouri. Well, the Walker family, my great-grandmother's side, was from that crowd. Her name was Clyda Walker until she married my great-grandpa Vic. She was my Grandma Harry Hicks's mother, and here's her story. Grandma Walker had a new baby. Now I'm talking about my Grandma Clyda's mother. Had a new baby in about 1890, and as so often happened in those days, the baby got sick and died. Grandma Walker was devastated and inconsolable. So Grandpa Walker, being a man and the type of person that had to try to fix things, felt he had to do something to help his wife out. So he went out, saddled his horse, and rode up to the top of the valley where a clan of gypsies had been camped for a few weeks. He did some bartering with those people and traded a couple of his prime horses to the gypsies for a little baby girl that they had in their camp. I guess that's how adoption took place in the U.S. before the government got involved. Anyway, Grandpa Walker swaddled the little baby and took her back home to his wife. They named that little baby Clyda, and she grew up in the Walker family and eventually married my great-grandpa in about 1910. Interesting thing about Grandma Clyda, she had a photographic memory. She had memorized most of the books in the Bible and could easily recite them from memory. My Grandpa Harry spoke reverently of his mother and all the gospel teachings she taught him as a kid, reciting directly from the Bible. When I listened to those stories, I was glad my mom didn't have a photographic memory. I don't know what I would have done if she would have been reciting whole Bible books to me as a kid. I could barely get through just reading the Old Testament on my own. Anyway, one time, Grandpa said she figured that he needed some teaching because of his cussing and swearing and carrying on like a crazy guy. So she recited the entire book of Ecclesiastes to him. She was a God-fearing woman. I mentioned earlier that not only were the men rough and tough in the early days of Idaho, but also the women. And here's a story to illustrate that. Grandpa Hicks's older sister, Mildred, a woman that I mentioned a few times in other episodes, was a big, strong woman who did not take crap from anyone. In fact, she told me herself one time that she married her husband Corky because he was the only man she knew who could whip her in a fist fight. I never asked how she came to find that out. Anyway, Aunt Mildred was rough and tough. One time she was coming over the Williams Creek Divide from Cobalt, just southwest of Salmon, when she came upon some out-of-state hunters. Those hunters were in a Willys Jeep, and the Jeep had a flat tire. So, like what most Idahoans would do, she stopped to see if they needed help. The hunters informed her that they busted a tire and did not have a jack to change the tire. Mildred informed them that she didn't have a jack herself, but she could easily lift the Jeep up while they changed the tire. But in payment, she would be asking for the fancy Pendleton hunting shirt that one of the men was wearing. Everyone agreed, so Aunt Mildred walked over, braced her legs, and deadlifted the Jeep high enough to slide a block of wood under the axle. When the tire was changed, she lifted the car back up and the men slid the wood out and all was good. So then Mildred asked for payment. The man with the Pendleton shirt said that this was his best shirt and he had no intention of giving it to her. "Listen, mister, you've got 3 seconds to take that shirt off and pay up before I come over there and collect myself." "Lady, it's not going to happen," he said. Before he could say another word, she stepped in with a straight right jab to the jaw and dropped that guy right in his tracks, out cold. Then she unbuttoned his shirt and took it off him while all his hunting buddies just stood there, afraid to make a move. She got back in her car and left as the men stood around their fallen comrade, trying to wake him up so they could get back to camp. As my dad always used to say, never underestimate the strength or power of anyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. I hope you like it. For those of you who would like to subscribe to this podcast, click on the link posted with this episode. You'll be given some options to subscribe with iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or even Spotify. Pick what works best for you. Also, if you feel inclined to support this podcast, click the appropriate Buzzsprout link. All donations are gladly accepted. It's my goal to never pollute my show with distracting ads. Anyone desiring to join the Facebook group Growing Up in Idaho, just let me know. Anyone's welcome. Thanks for listening. Growing Up in Idaho, the good old days.